Welcome back to BrainWise. I'm Cole Bastian, your host, and I'm joined by my co-host, Phil Dixon. And we are here to talk about another episode related to our brains and how we can use it to decode what's happening in our life. And today we've got a really interesting conversation because we've been talking a lot about the brain up until this point I think we're now at 13 plus episodes, which is a celebration moment, honestly. But which is almost like 13 hours of content, quite honestly, that we have released thus far. But we haven't yet, Phil, talked about what the brain actually is or what it's made of. We may have left little notes or anecdotes throughout or little tidbits of information. But today we're going to really spend some time talking about what is it made of. And I think one of the challenges that we want to just authentically share with our BrainWise friends is how we make this really fun and applicable for everyone who's listening. And especially for the general population, we're going to follow Phil's father advice, which is if we can't fix it, feature it. So we're going to feature that throughout our episode today, which is how do we really make what this conversation is all around, what our brain is made of, how do we make it applicable to all of you and to us even as we go along this journey. So stay with us as we go along. We've got a lot of really cool information that are just nuggets and information that you can use.
So a sort of metaphor for this might be we taught you how to drive the car. Now we're going to tell you how the engine works, and more particularly how the fuel injection and some of the carburetor works. For some people, you're going to go, I really don't care, but we'll do our very best to actually take the detail and say, and by the way, this is what it means.
And I think you had mentioned earlier, we're going to give them enough information to have a really fun conversation at a cocktail party.
That's exactly right. So one of success is, do we give you enough information that you can bore other people at a cocktail party and force them at least to go and get another gin and tonic or vodka soda, whatever they drink.
Exactly. Then always, of course, plug at the cocktail party, my BrainWise coach. Search that in your podcast device so that way you can find us.
There we go.
Get us some more listeners while you're out there. All right. Very good. Before we dive in, Phil, how is the kitchen remodel coming along? Hopefully we're getting closer to that egg being boiled. We might need to add a video of it once it actually happens to our podcast, but how is it going and how has your week been?
I have slightly less hair than I started off at the beginning of the week because I pulled it out. Monday was due to have all the appliances delivered, and 50% of them got delivered and installed. We still don't have a refrigerator, but literally as we're recording this, they are downstairs installing the refrigerator. So by the end of the day, we should have a refrigerator and a microwave oven. So by the close of business today, I hope to have boiled an egg indoors.
Because so far you've been boiling it on a campfire outside the house.
That's exactly right.
We're all rooting for you that the next time we check in, you've had a few eggs by that point, maybe not just the one that'll be boiled this evening. And what's your BrainWise or brain unwise moment from the week?
A little different to normal.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I've been depressed about is the political situation here in America. And so what was going through my brain is whether we should remain apolitical or whether we should actually have a discussion about it. Last week, we talked about Charlie Kirk's death, and we came out strongly against that. And that's not okay. Yeah, fully agree. But what I realized is that will be a difference between making myself brain wise or brain unwise. But it was more important for our brain wise listeners that we offer them a safe and neutral space. So that's why I elected we're going to remain agnostic. And so we'll focus on the brain and the neuroscience and let the rest of the political world swirl above our heads.
And maybe they'll be able to use, or hopefully they'll be able to use some of the information that we're sharing to help make sense of what's going on in the political environment from their perspective. So I think it's a great place to stay, is being politically agnostic and letting that part of the world and those who decide to comment on things politically, let them take that, and we'll take what we're really good at, which is all things the brain and a little bit of behavior sprinkled in.
There we go. And some an occasional humor.
Always. I don't think, Phil, we've ever gotten together and not laughed. Give us 5 minutes and we'll be laughing by the end of that 5 minutes.
And so I was recontacted by a lady called Karen Buxman, who has focused her whole consulting career on humor in the workplace. So I think one of the things we might do in a couple of months' time is have her as a guest speaker on this podcast.
Oh, I would love that, because then people can understand how to integrate the two. Because I think there is sometimes challenges. How do you integrate humor into the workplace specifically? And then how do you use it appropriately, probably even just in a personal context? Because sometimes humor can be, we're laughing at someone versus laughing with someone. And how do we draw the line there so that we can all have a really good time?
And I think that's an important point you just made, how to use it appropriately. You and I are really good at using it inappropriately.
Exactly. But we're in a safe space between the two of us. Add in a third, and we might be a little less risk-taking and go after it in that sense.
Moving right along.
Exactly. This week started off strong and it's ending strong. So that's not unfortunate. That's actually positive. But the unfortunate part is in the middle of it, and this is probably an over-exaggeration to some degree, but I felt like I was tiptoeing at death's door for 2 days this week, because I felt I have had the worst stomach bug or some kind of gastrointestinal something happening for 2 days this week. And it was
not too much information, please.
No
shit.
But thankfully, I am in a much better place now, feeling good. My body is healed. I feel back to 100%, which is great. And so I would say I probably didn't have many intentional BrainWise moments this week, because my body just went into kind of autopilot for a couple of days. And really what it was is my brain saying, Cole, you need to take a break. You need to slow down, rest, and get better. And that's what I did. I didn't force myself to do something that I wasn't ready to do. I allowed myself the space to relax and get better and to rest and to heal. And so whether it was intentional or unintentional, or it was my non-conscious saying, Cole, time out. It's time for you to just slow down. And that's what I did. And so thankfully I did that, and I'm feeling tremendously better today. So that way we can record our episode and be more accomplished. And I actually started feeling better, even better yesterday, which was great. So that's where we are. And that was my BrainWise moment, I guess I would say, outside of it being intentional. I took a break and allowed my body to heal, which there is a connection, obviously, between what's happening in the body and then obviously what's happening in the brain.
And so first of all, welcome back to the land of the living.
Thank you.
We're glad to have you back. And there, I believe, a couple of things difficult to prove, but I think there's more and more evidence, especially out of the Eastern medicine world, of the linkage between the two. The Western medicine world is so slowly catching up to the fact that there is a linkage between the brain and the gut. There's linkage between the brain, the heart, and the lungs. So all those things are starting to come much more holistic in our approach. I'm sure your brain did give you a message that said, let's shut down for a couple of hours.
100%. And it was a couple of days, and I was just like, but we're back into the land of the living, as you call it, and we're operating on all cylinders, which is great. And I actually feel good. I could probably run a marathon, but I'm not going to do that. But I probably could.
And when you do, could you do a couple of miles for me?
Oh, I sure will. I definitely will. That is something I haven't got back into, is the gym. I took about a 3-day break now from going to the gym, which one part of my brain's, okay, you need to go and work out. But on the other side, it's, hey, Cole, give yourself a little bit of grace. So I'll get back into it tomorrow, and I'll add those couple of miles in for you then.
I appreciate it. Thanks.
Very good. Let's get into the conversation, Phil, that I think will be interesting for many. And then maybe for some will think, okay, how does this apply and why is this interesting for me? And so we're going to do our best to feature that along this journey, but what the brain is actually made of. And so we're going to have a good discussion around that. And let's dive into the first part of that conversation, which is, let's start with the basics. How big is the brain and how does its size compare to the rest of the body?
First of all, the brain's about 3 pounds for most people, give or take a little bit. There's been all sorts of theories and conjecture about whether it's going to get bigger or smaller and why it's the size it is. Clearly, we don't have any brains that are left over from 1 million years ago. We have the bones, the brains are all gone. So pretty much everything we have is conjecture. We've measured the size of people's skulls back over the years. Some people say there's a trend for it getting smaller. Some people say, no, it's actually getting larger. Some people say it's defined by we've got very large brains now. And so therefore X, Y, and Z as a result of the theory. It's about 3 pounds, which is, depending on your size of your body, is between 1.5% and 3% of your body weight. And the reason why that's important is when we come to the next topic, which is how much energy does the brain use? But it's somewhere around 2% of your body weight on average. So that's the first trivia question that you could answer on what's the ratio of the body to brain weight. So anywhere between 1% and 3%, you get a correct answer.
It's interesting. One of the things that I was just thinking about, we could use this to help us in our daily life is when we think about the brain, its weight is, you said 1% to 3% for most people, yet it controls everything within our body.
Absolutely. It is. There's nothing, we've said this before, there's nothing, I know I'm going to use a double negative, there's nothing that doesn't happen that hasn't started right between our ears. And that's true for whether you're talking about deciding what to take in the way of the next bite from the plate, or whether to press the button for a nuclear war.
Right.
It's all starting right between the ears.
Which I think is an interesting kind of parallel to, if we think about it in the context of our professional world, scale doesn't always equal impact, because you can make a small or tiny shift in perspective can change how an entire team functions, right? And so I think that's an interesting parallel to what we just talked about. The brain is only 1% to 3% of our body mass, yet it controls everything. How can that apply to our lives? Doesn't mean that everything, all the changes we've been talking about, Phil, over the last number of podcast or episodes, doesn't mean that they have to be large scale changes, because even small ones, right? I think it was in Mulan, the movie, it said one single grain of rice can tip the scale. In this case, it's very similar to the size of the brain compared to the overall operating machine that it's driving.
Absolutely. And we've talked about some of the major impacts, and now we're going to go and we're going to start looking at where did that come from? And we'll remind us, we're not going to try and get into the soul and consciousness and the mind and things like that. That's outside the scope of this discussion.
Absolutely. Which you mentioned in your previous commentary around the energy consumption. So why does the brain consume so much of our body's energy? And how much does it consume?
At rest, let's say you and I right now, we're occupying, I think, I can't remember the exact data. Let me look it up. Yes. So we're basically at rest. The body uses about 70 watts of energy. So that's about the same as a fairly old style incandescent light bulb. And of that, the brain, like we are now, the brain occupies about 20% of that energy. And we can measure that by the consumption of both oxygen and glucose. And so we can measure the body's consumption, the rate at which the heart pumps blood, and all those type of things. We can come up and actually look at the amount it consumes. So it's 20%
of the body's energy.
The body's energy.
Yeah.
Now let's take a look and go back to our 1% to 2%. Let's land at 1% to 3%. Let's land at 2%. That means on average, the brain is taking 10 times more per cubic inch, per cubic centimeter, per gram, whatever you want to measure it by, than the rest of the body. It's a huge energy hog. And that's one of the reasons that all the theorists, myself included, believe that the reason why the brain functions the way it does is to actually maximize the efficiency of it, because it is such an energy hog.
Which I think there is something to be said for when we think about our physical body might not be exhausted. You get home and you're depleted or you feel drained. It's probably just related to what we just described, which is your brain has been using so much energy throughout the course of the day that you may not physically, like your muscles and all of that probably are not physically exhausted, but you're mentally exhausted because you've used up all of your energy just to go about your day and make decisions.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And the decision making is very depleting for the prefrontal cortex particularly. And we'll come back to that in a moment. But they've lots and lots of research done on how many decisions you make during the day and the impact that has on how active the prefrontal cortex is. So there was a wonderful piece of work done, and I don't think we've covered this before, where they had two groups, and the groups were separated, and they had chocolate in front of them. Have we covered this before? I don't remember.
We did the ice cream story, I think. The ice cream, I think you called it was ice cream in that one. Maybe it might be a different one.
Yeah, so this is where the two groups had chocolate. And one group was said, eat as much chocolate as you want. And the other group was told, no, you can't eat chocolate. And they had to go through a long meeting. And so the one group could eat as much chocolate as they want. The other one was, nope, can't do it, can't do it, can't do it. And then they went into a standard creativity test at the end. And the groups that was allowed to have chocolate found themselves way more creative than those that had to prevent themselves. Now, they controlled for the impact of chocolate itself. But they basically found, and the theory is, those people who were prevented from eating chocolate had so many decisions to make that the prefrontal cortex was actually depleted as a result of their tamping themselves down.
I was hoping you were going to give us an excuse to eat more chocolate, but it doesn't sound like that's the case.
One of these days, I will find a reason for you to eat chocolate and ice cream together.
Perfect. I was on the tip of my toes thinking, okay, this is going to be my moment. I can now eat as much chocolate as I want to. But unfortunately for our BrainWise friends, it's not the moral of the story. The story is around the decisions.
I can twist it in the fact that if you don't want to deplete your brain, eat the chocolate.
Exactly, or whatever it is. Oh, that's too funny.
There's how to apply it in real life.
Yeah, exactly. We've talked a lot, since we're on the subject of chocolate and fuel, the brain is using so much energy. What kind of fuel does the brain actually run on? What is it depleting?
It is depleting basically oxygen and glucose. That's its fundamental. I'm sure there's other things in there, chemicals which are catalysts to those reactions, but primarily oxygen and glucose. And I did mention the prefrontal cortex.
Yeah.
And I said that the brain takes about 20% of the body's energy. The prefrontal cortex, which is a tiny piece at the very front, don't know the exact ratio, but it's a tiny piece. It occupies 20% of the brain's energy. Wow. So you've got this tiny little piece that's very particular to the executive functioning of the brain, occupying an inordinate share of the brain's energy. It's also one of the reasons why your brain stores about 10 minutes of fuel and of oxygen and glucose. It's already in there. And it's one of the reasons why if your brain is depleted or prevented from getting that fuel, you've got a maximum of about 10% before there's serious damage to the brain.
Wow. Okay.
I said 10%. I should have said 10 minutes.
No, I think it makes total sense. And I think it connects back to what we were talking about with decision-making because rational decision-making is happening in the prefrontal cortex. That's why when you make so many of those decisions, that part of the brain, it's using up so much more energy, which is consuming more of what the brain is actually taking from the body, which then obviously makes us feel more drained throughout our day.
And let's take it back to one of the previous podcasts. And that is when the brain gets depleted, there are things that it's not so good at making those other decisions, but it's also less good at self-control, less good at empathy, all those type of things. So when you have had a busy day with the brain, you've done lots of decision making, you come home, you've survived the journey home because you were on autopilot anyway, driving along, you get home, you're not going to be as empathetic and you have self-control as you might have done at 9 o'clock in the morning.
Right.
Way to get around that. One of the things to do, we're learning more and more, is go out for a 20-minute, half-hour walk in nature in the woods to give your brain a reboost.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now, make sure you're safe in the woods, right? We want to put a little asterisk on that. But yes, I think it's a great idea because I know that when we get out, and that's one of the books that you're reading right now, and in obviously just the way that our brains are created or they function, is it's better when we're out moving in nature and doing something different than what we were doing before.
Yep, that helps a lot.
Yeah. And I think, Phil, one of the things we're talking, there's also this concept that's been floated, which is left brain, right brain. And we hear about that a little bit and what's associated with creativity, right? All of those types of things. Is that division really as important as people had once thought it was?
So the answer to that question is probably not. But let's actually look at the reality. The brain is divided into two.
Yeah.
So there's a left brain and a right brain. and it's connected by a big bundle of tissues in the middle called the corpus callosum. But what we're learning is that while there may be like a nexus or a center of activity of one type or another, it's very integrated into everything in the brain. The brain is, above anything else, is integrated across both halves. So although you might have people have been talking about speech is on the left or the right or whatever it is, there's components of it on the left and there's components of it on the right. There's some centers, but it used to be the laterality was the most important thing. I believe now the more important thing to talk about is the actual integration and networking across both halves.
Which I think is important too when you think about, how for a while we were probably boxing in certain types of, if you're a left brain thinker or a right brain thinker, and creating categories for people, but we're more complex than that in general, just as human beings. And so being careful to not always label ourselves as something, but really look at the full scope of who the human being is.
Absolutely. And one of the things that was damaging, I believe, in 20 years, 30 years ago, is when we had all these personality types or the brain types. We had labeled people. What would happen is people would self-contain and go, wait a minute, what do you expect? I'm a left brain person. You can't expect me to be relationship oriented. No, we've all got the same abilities in our brain. Whether we're using them or not is a different question. So the idea that the integrated network of brain, think of the brain as the internet in your head, where the internet has got so many branches, so many interconnections between them. Search engines navigate through all these different processes. That's probably the best metaphor you can actually use for the brain rather than a left brain, right brain.
Exactly. And one of the things we've prefaced is we don't want to ever give people excuses to opt out of having to focus on improving their life, right? Or giving an excuse for why they do something. We're all responsible still for the actions of our decisions, right? That end up happening, or what happens as a result of our decisions. And I think in this instance, even though someone may not be as good at demonstrating empathy, or there may not be a propensity for some things, that doesn't mean that they can't do it. So rather than boxing people in, you just may not have the natural propensity, but you can certainly learn. You may never be as good as someone else at something, just like someone's not ever probably going to be as good as you are at something. But that doesn't mean that we can't stretch ourselves and learn to do things that are outside of our comfort zone in this case.
And there's a wonderful cartoon, I think it was published in Punch magazine in England. It had a picture of a guy grabbing hold of his brain and pulling it to one side. And the caption said, once extended, a brain never goes back to its original size. So, when you decide to extend your brain and learn something new, you won't ever unlearn that.
Right. Which is awesome. And I think to pile on to the internet analogy or metaphor that you were giving and how everything's so interconnected, how many neurons are in the brain and why does that number matter?
Well, first of all, we don't know. The bottom line is, but there are some intelligent guesses. So let me give you a little bit of history. First of all, we just knew that there was a lot of them, and scientists gradually started to measure how many there were. Now, there aren't too many people that would turn around and donate their live brain, go measure the number of neurons in it, and then want it back. So that's never happened. So we've never actually counted them one by one, at least not yet. What we tend to do is guesstimate how many there are. And it used to be, there's 100 billion. That used to be the big round number. And then another neuroscientist did some more accurate measurement. And what they did is, if I remember rightly, they took a cubic centimeter, and sliced it and actually counted the number of neurons that they could actually count in a microscope, and then multiply that up by the volume of the brain and go, we've got 85 billion, not 100 billion. No, there's a tariff in there somewhere. And then another neuroscientist came along and said, that's not quite right still. And they did their calculation and they came up with 86 billion. All right, that seems, quotes, the most accurate number. However, if you read that paper and you got down towards the bottom and they actually added at the bottom, plus or minus 7 billion. So So
A high degree of variability there.
right. We know it's probably somewhere between the low 80s and the low 90s and somewhere in there. Does it really matter other than the fact that there's a lot of them? And as we'll talk about in a moment, I'm sure, and they've got major interconnections going on, which is where we led to the network and the internet metaphor just now.
Right, but why don't we talk about that then and go into how are those neurons actually networked together?
So let's talk a little bit about a neuron, and that is that it's got a sort of, I don't know how you did quite do. I've never tried to describe auditorily what a neuron looks like. It's very difficult, but it's got like a sort of lump at one end, a long, thin extension. Let's just call it that. I'm trying to avoid the actual words. And then it branches out into a number of others. And the health of the neuron is actually looked about how long these extensions are and how many branches there are. Each of those branches connects to another neuron, almost. There's actually a little gap between the end of one and the beginning of the other. That's called the synapse in between. And so in a healthy brain, those neurons, let's go with 86 billion of them, 86 billion neurons are connected to anywhere between 10,000 others and 50,000 others. So now if you multiply those numbers together, 86 billion neurons, each connected by 30, 40, 50,000 others, you've got trillions of connections that are going on inside that 3-pound organ that's in between our ears.
It's absolutely fascinating to think about how the brain is so interconnected and that there's trillions, as you were describing it, connections between all the neurons and when we make decisions and just the implications. And I can see in my mind's eye how all of those things are connected and how the different things are moving around. I'm sure others are too. And I think the internet metaphor is definitely important and I think helps to bring it into scope because there's trillions of connections and signals are passing through all of those different areas. And it also, from a personal perspective, it may be to some degree, there's a parallel between why relationships matter so much because we're wired for connection. So relationships, whether you want to call yourself an extrovert, introvert, whatever, there is a degree of we all want to fellowship or be around other people in some capacity. And so that connection, I think there is an interesting link between that and then how the brain is actually wired with these trillions of connections.
And I can't ever remember these numbers, so I'm going to read them from the book. You can research this on Google Scholar or anything like that. So in an infant's brain, as many as 2 million new connections are formed every second.
Wow.
That's almost mind-boggling to get your mind around. By age 2, a child has over 100 trillion connections, double the number an adult has. And so kids, when they're fumbling around or they're putting things in their mouth or they're feeling or whatever, they are making connections at some phenomenal rate. And they end up with over 100 trillion connections. Now, that will gradually get pared down during the lifetime, especially during the teenage years. Now, there's an old adage which says neurons that fire together wire together, right? But what happens somewhere around the age of 11, 12, 13, if those connections have not been used, then they start to get pared out. And so that's actually what's happening. But imagine 2 million connections being made every second in its brains. That's mind-boggling.
It is. And it's probably why it probably explains a lot of other things around why it's so important for kids to engage and how they learn and what they're ultimately doing isn't just fumbling around. It's actually learning and making connections as they go along that experience.
Yeah, everything the kids are doing is forming the brain's there, but now we're forming all the connections between those things. Really important. It's one of the reasons why, the phonemes that kids learn, that's the individual parts of words and how they sound. Those are laid down between 0 and 18 months. Reasons why it's very difficult for a more adult brain to learn accents in a language. We can learn the language itself, but getting the right accent has been laid down a long, long while ago.
Wow. Just absolutely fascinating. which probably goes to it's probably easier to learn a second language when you're much younger than it is as we get older.
Yeah. And so now let's put it into terms of applicability.
Yeah.
For our listeners, there's a book by a guy called John Medina called Brain Rules for Baby. We'll put this in the linkage. But he talks about the importance of bringing kids up in a BrainWise fashion. And he's got, I think it's 12 rules for bringing up kids so that we honor what's going on in their brains.
I'll have to take a look at that. I think it's fascinating. And maybe we'll put the link in our show notes for people so that if they want to, especially if they have young children of their own, where can they go get some resources or additional information on how to, if it's of interest, do raise your child in a BrainWise fashion, or at least know what some of those principles are anyways.
He wants to go into the brain in more detail than we are. The guy to research there is a guy called Robert Sapolsky. I think he's still at Stanford University. Phenomenal expert in his latest book is called Behave, if I remember rightly. It's a thick book. It's not a trivial book, but some phenomenal detail on how the brain works. He wrote the book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers.
Fascinating. And now my brain's going in a whole nother direction on that. And okay, how do I become a zebra so that I don't get ulcers too? Is it because of worry, anxiety?
Basically, yes. He said if you watch a zebra run away, it's being driven by its brain to get the heck out of there to survive. Right. Once it's survived, if the lion catches it, it's all over. But once it's survived, it doesn't then worry about what goes on. It's over and done with.
Interesting. It's just so fascinating. And they're probably not worried up until that point about the fact that the lion is coming. It's just once the lion is there, time to go.
Yeah, exactly.
Very interesting. So many things we could unpack there for ourselves when we think about being nervous or anxious or having worry, things of that nature, which I'm going to make an interesting transition to another part of the brain's makeup, which is, and hopefully it makes sense and we'll connect it along the journey as best we can. But we often hear about glial cells, and I'm curious, what role do they play in our brains?
So what glial actually means is glue. I think if I remember right, either the Latin or Greek for glue. And it's the glue that holds it together. Each of those neurons is in a sheath. And it's the cells that are around that sheath. Those are the glue. There's more and more evidence, and there's probably 10 times as many glial cells as there are neurons. We don't know that, but there's a lot of them. And it seems like a lot of the damage that gets done to the brain is damage to those sheaths. A lot of the cancers that are starting off actually cancers of the sheaths around those. And probably a lot more study needs to be done on that. I forget what again, there's a book that's just written about the glial cells. If anyone really wants to delve in, you can find that. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. There's a lot of so we've talked about the impact for sleep on the brain. And let's look at a little bit. This is going into practicality now. First of all, most of us in America, at least, don't get enough sleep. Now, I'm not going to go into what is enough, because there's lots of schools of thought, but most of us don't get enough. One of the reasons that we believe that dementia occurs is because the brain doesn't go in the sleep process. The gap between the neurons seems to expand, and therefore the detritus from all the work that we've done in the brain during the day can get flushed out, and that's happening during sleep. If it doesn't get flushed out, then that seems to be what forms the plaque, which is where dementia starts to arise. So we're starting to learn the real importance of sleep. Pushing forward like 20, 30 years, slept well in your 30s and 40s, you're more likely to get impacted by dementia in your 70s and 80s.
Wow.
So
really interesting.
Putting it into practice in life, get more sleep.
Absolutely. I think it's important, and obviously finding what the right amount is for you and where you feel most efficient and healthy. I know for me, 7 hours is on average usually pretty good, but if I could get that every day, it'd be great. So I want to just talk a little bit about When we think about the glue is what you were calling it, and that's where we were just describing, you're going into a bit more context, is there's also this idea that that's probably in the brain is a little bit overlooked, right? It's those particular cells are probably not always seen as maybe they're a bit, I'm just going to stick with the phrase they're overlooked. In our lives at home or even at work, who are some of the people that maybe being overlooked by some degree, but they're actually very essential to the family continuing to run, for all the things to be happening? They're just in the background making things run successfully, but without them, it wouldn't run as successfully. Same thing for those in the work context. And so ensuring that we don't overlook those individuals and that we acknowledge their contribution to how we are as an organization or as a family really being able to run successfully, because that's ultimately what you were just describing as the glial cells in the brain. They may not be the front runner in terms of the conversation, but they're absolutely critical to the overall health and efficiency of the brain.
That's a really nice metaphor. Yes. We need to make certain that all components of every system are taken into account.
And so now I'd like to talk a bit about kind of I don't know if it's the shape or kind of the look of the brain, maybe is a better way to describe it. But the brain is famously wrinkled. On a lot of the pictures that we see or depictions of it is wrinkled. Why is that important?
We don't know why that came from an evolutionary point of view, but we can take some guesses. And one is, if something is wrinkled like that, it has more surface area. And so it's probably the surface area where some important activity is happening. I'm sure if I was a detailed neuroscience scientist, I could tell you exactly what was going on in those surface areas. But increasing a surface area is the bottom line of why that's important. Mm-hmm. If you actually look at it, if you've ever looked at a sweet chestnut and the surface of a sweet chestnut, it looks very similar.
Okay, very interesting. And when we think about the overall brain itself, how much of it is devoted to vision?
Probably, again, depending on the neuroscientists you listen to, 60 to 70% somewhere. Go with 2/3 and you won't be far wrong.
Wow. Probably helps with the whole adage of it's no wonder that visuals stick with us more than words to some degree, right? Because we are so visually stimulating. And obviously in my line of work, being a leadership coach or an L&D professional, we do a lot of work when we put together programming around visuals, because they seem to really do carry a lot of weight when helping people learn. Now, there's other modes of learning or vehicles of learning, of course, but visual seems to be a fairly predominating context when we talk about learning, and at least in my experience, and this probably explains it to some degree.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I was surprised the other day, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was talking to, quotes, an expert in the coaching field, and he had developed a new model of coaching and presented it, and it was all text. There wasn't a single visual in it whatsoever. And and we all have got different, how important visual is to all of us. We do know that 2/3 of the brain is visual oriented. How important it is, it depends on some of your background, some of your genetics and things like that. Right. But to have no visuals and only text is like a brain 101 no-no. You need to have some visual stimulation. If you can have oral, visual, and text, ideally kinesthetic at the same time, right, that's where learning really occurs.
I think it's really interesting because social media has taken a predominant kind of state in our society today, and it really has shaped whether it's good or not. We could sit here and debate that, of course, and I think probably a lot of people would recognize that there's a negative side to it as well as probably a positive side. But with social media, I think part of why it's become such a predominating force within our society is a variety of things, but specifically, there's a lot of visuals connected to it. It took it from the space of we have books or we've got emails that are coming out or written communication to integrating visual, so pictures, integrating video, which is now moving graphics and auditory, as well as some text. But I would challenge us to think, and I even myself, for example, TikTok. I'm a big TikTok user. I fell into the trend, unfortunately, or fortunately, however you decide to look at it, post-COVID. And I rarely look at the captions. There's always a caption that comes along with the post. And I think for creators, it's mainly to use for the search algorithm. So that way you come up in the search of the people who are trying to find content related to yours. But most people are focused on the visual. I am anyways, that the more it can hook me at the beginning, the visual of it, and then obviously the auditory and the experience of it all. I think there's obviously something that comes into the addictive cycle too, from the release of dopamine as it's giving things that connect with my schema and all of those things. But I also think that specifically as we transition to the social media and the TikTok era, it's played a lot on the part of our brain being highly visually stimulated because it's what
Yep.
it's mainly focused on.
Yep. And things that are moving are more important to the brain than things that are static.
Right.
Again, from an evolutionary point of view, if something was static, it was less likely to kill you than something that was moving.
Interesting, which is probably why we're seeing a shift to videos and reels and those kinds of things, and even Instagram and Facebook, because in order to stay relevant, they had to evolve to what obviously the TikTok era was being able to provide. And it's related to what you just described, because moving pictures obviously have more intrigue in the brain. So my last question for you, Phil, as we wrap up our conversation around what the brain is made of, is around neuroplasticity. And people might be going, how does that fit into the context of what it's made of? And I'm going to obviously allow you to make that connection for people. But what does this actually mean, and why is it of importance to us?
First of all, what it means is that the brain can grow and change, evolve, even when we are older. We used to think that once you were a certain age, 16, 17, 18, 19, then that was it. Your brain was the way it was, and that was what you were stuck with for the rest of your life. We now know that's not true. Something bad happens to the brain. The brain will gradually re-evolve and change. Even the use of some of the neurons will change so that they adapt to what the brain currently needs. So what neuroplasticity really means is the ability for the brain to change. That's essentially what it's about. And it does. You forget the idea that you have a brain and it's exactly the same as it was 10 years ago. Each time you learn, each time you transition in some way, shape, or form, the brain is changing.
And even listening to this podcast, or even as I were recording it, I think our brain is being rewired slightly, which for me, it gives me hope personally and professionally, because it means none of us are stuck. We can all grow, learn, adapt, rewire. Relationships can heal, teams can change. And then I think the overall summary is that the brain's flexibility, or its ability to change and to grow, is our greatest gift, because it allows us to move forward versus being stuck where we were.
Absolutely. And if you turn around, and we've talked a little bit, I think, on a growth mindset.
Mm-hmm.
Growth mindset is based on curiosity. And let's look and find out what's new, what is out there, what's the other side of that door. Let's open it up and take a look, whether that's a metaphorical door or a real door. The brain is going to change as a result of doing all those things.
Right. No, I think it's fantastic. And what interesting little tidbits that we've been able to share along this journey of today's conversation around what the brain is made of. And Phil, how would you summarize for our listeners the conversation that we've had today, and maybe how they might be able to apply it to decode in their life?
Take care. I think probably what I would say is take care of your brain. It is an immensely complex organ. We've described some of the attributes of the brain from a compositional point of view, but what we haven't spent much time on is how do you take care of it? Stress is bad for the brain, period. End of story. All she wrote. Sleep is good for the brain. Being positive turns out to be good for the brain as well. There's some things you can do on a regular basis. Exploring a new language is a wonderful thing for the brain. So there's been a lot of debate about whether doing crosswords or playing brain games or those type of things, are they good or bad for the brain? They're never going to be bad for the brain. Whether they have a positive impact or not doesn't matter. But I do 15 minutes of brain games every morning. Is it improving my brain? I have no way of knowing.
I think it is.
But
anecdotally, I'm going to give you a thumbs up.
Thank you. But we don't know. But it's not going to do any harm.
Right.
And so eating the right foods, exercise. We know exercise is great for the brain. One of our podcasts will be the care and feeding of the brain. But hey, it's an incredibly complex, very delicate organ. Take care of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a great way to summarize it, which I think we'll be happy to know that we only have 3 possible reflection questions in addition to what you've shared. And a couple of them are an interesting spin. So I think that's why I want to share them, because it's an interesting spin on what we've talked about today. So the first one is, as you think about what you've learned today and what we've shared around what the brain is made of, pick 1 or 2 of these or all of them, whatever works best for you, to reflect on as we have gone along this journey. And the first question is, what's one wrinkle in your own life that has made you wiser? What an interesting pun there, or play on words. I like it.
Love it.
How are you fueling your brain, not just with food, but with rest, connection, and curiosity? So that's good. And then the final one is, where do you need to create new networks at work or in your personal relationships? So another cool play on words. As you think of the networks of the brain or how the brain is wrinkled, I think those were 2 really interesting connections and reference points to how people can reflect as they move forward in the next week or so.
Great. Love it.
So our BrainWise friends, that's our episode for today. So hopefully you were able to pull some really cool nuggets out of what we discussed today around what the brain is made of and how you can use some of that information to make different decisions for yourself, take care of your brain, really enjoy the complexity of what your brain is, and knowing that it's constantly changing, learning, and evolving. And so, as always, if you liked our episode today, go ahead and like it, rate it on your favorite podcast streaming platform, share it with others, comment, subscribe, whatever it is, that you would prefer to do to support our podcast. But we would love if you get the opportunity to share it with those in your circle, both professionally and personally, so they too can become more brainwise to decode their own life. And as always, stay curious, stay compassionate, and stay brainwise. We'll talk to you next week.